long lecture. I'm going to try and keep it as interesting as I can. Our goal today is to work our way through 1763 up to the beginning of the Revolution. How is it that in 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, you had a bunch of colonists who were thrilled as heck at the outcome of the French and Indian War, proud, loyal Englishmen, God save the King, proud to fly the Union Jack? How is it that in the course of only 12 years, which is not a long time, we went from that to shots being fired at the King's troops, treason being committed, and a war of rebellion against the authority of the Crown and Parliament taking place? What happened in those 12 years to bring us to there? I will get the phone. There's so much before. No, sorry. Alright, yes, your question, right.
Oh no, I was gonna say that, the taxes.
So that's only a part. So
What about the war against the French? Remember when they had that frontier place?
well, that's where our brackets, if you will. We have the end of the French and Indian War and the beginning of the American Revolution. We are going to talk about today what is happening in those 12 years. Here are a bunch of colonists fighting side by side with the British, proud and happy to be Englishmen. And only 12 little years later, the same people are fighting against the British. What happened? What made these colonists choose to start a military confrontation with the world's most powerful country? We have to answer that question. How did you get there? How did people's minds change?
Oh.
It's not an active question. That is the question that we will be answering all today. It's not a question I'm looking for an answer for right now. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, so Great Britain, we left the colonies alone to develop their own economical and religious and all that stuff. And then when they tried to gain more control over the colonies, the English didn't like that because since they've been doing it that way for a long time.
Lewis is right. I mean, that's the short answer. The short answer is, after letting this independent nation grow up on the Atlantic colony, on the Atlantic seaboard, the British then tried to take control of that nation. Kevin.
What about George Washington when he became like a general, I think it was, and he had the entire colonial army on his side.
Well, that's here. The only reason you need a general in a colonial army is if someone somewhere has decided to fight.
No, it was in a book before the revolution started.
No. Washington's a commander of militia in this war, and then Washington volunteers and gets approved by Congress to be the general-in-chief of the colonial troops in the Revolutionary War. Our question, again, is what happened here? How did George Washington go from an officer fighting under the Union Jack to an officer fighting against those very same forces? That's the question. And what Lewis told us is precisely right. And I want to kind of create a metaphor here for you that I think if you understand the metaphor, everything that happens here, you will see it kind of in line with this metaphor. I want you to imagine that you're 8 or 9 years old. And at the age of 8 or 9 years old, your parents say to you, we're going to let you live at home, but other than that, you're on your own. Feed yourself, take care of yourself, take yourself to school, get your school supplies, do your homework. From the age of 8 or 9, you are on your own. I definitely think and tell me if you agree with me or not, that if you, being in that circumstance, figured out how to do that, and by the time you were 17 years old, you would probably be a pretty independent-minded, capable, confident human being. That if you had lived like that and had figured it out from the age 8 to 17, doing everything on your own way, if you had made it by the age of 17, you would be a very self-directed, independently minded type of person, wouldn't you? I think. Now I want you to imagine that at the age of 17, Mom comes back into your life and says, all right, here are the rules. You're going to be in-house by 10 o'clock. You're going to do your homework now. Here's all your list of chores. This is what you're responsible for. How would you take that? Hell no. I do it my way. You left me on my own 10 years ago. I figured out how to do things on my own, and now here you are. Now, does Mom have a legal right to do that? Yeah, you're 17, you're a minor, you live under her roof. She has every right in the world to give you a curfew, to tell you what chores to do. That's her right as a parent. We can't argue that she shouldn't do that on a legal basis, because she has every right. But, how are you going to accept her coming in like that and dictating to you? Are you going to be happy? No. And if you, that's what happened here. That's what happens in these 12 years. That, like Lewis told us, after so many decades of pretty much developing on their own, the colonies by 1763 were their own nation. They weren't an independent state yet, but the people who lived there were very different from the people that had left England 100 years earlier. Different institutions had grown up. They had experienced different things. Their takes on things like representation, so fundamental things are different than from the British point of view and perspective. And when Great Britain comes in and starts to dictate laws, the colonists are by and large not going to like that very much. So we're going to start, we're going to work our way through all of these by the time we get out of here today. Now, you do not have to know all of these. You should be able to use some of these as examples if you are talking about the coming of the American Revolution. But you do not have to know all of them. Let's start with the Proclamation of 1763. I want you to be able, throughout the course of this lecture, I want you to be able to see what is happening from both points of view. You should be able to explain what is happening from the American point of view, and you should be able to explain what is happening from the British point of view. Well, we're going to start with the Proclamation of 1763. Here comes my awesome map-making skills. This would be Texas. Florida's down here. This is North America. It looks similar to a brontosaurus. This is Canada. Your 13 colonies are kind of spread out along the eastern seaboard here. After the French and Indian War, all of this stuff becomes British territory. It had been French. After the Treaty of Paris, 1763, it becomes English. Who lives here?
Indians.
Indians. And the British would like to keep it that way. The British do not want contact between the colonists and the Indians. Why not?
Because, well, to begin with, the Americans were actually complaining that the Indians should get reserves. So I think that the way the British responded to that was, first, they actually did want relationships because they thought it would be a good idea. And secondly, they just wanted to please the Americans.
What question did you just answer?
Right.
Why do the British want to keep the colonists away from the Indians? Esther. Less conflict. Because they know, as well as you do, that when colonists and Indians come into contact, there's conflict. And if the conflict gets bad enough, there's something called Pontiac's Rebellion. This is a response to this rebellion. The English say, we do not want colonists and Indians in contact with each other because it leads to fighting. And if the fighting gets bad enough, who do the colonists have to call? Britain. They don't want to, they just finished fighting a war. Wars are expensive. So they say, all right, we're drawing a line. Proclamation of 1763 line. Colonists, you stay on that side of the line. On this side of the line, that's where the Indians live. They're free to do whatever the hell they want over there. We're going to trade with them, the fur industry. The British are taking over that French fur industry. The British want the Indians over here to maintain trading relationships with, and they do not want the colonists and the settlers interfering with that. Now, this is a dumb, stupid, and awful law from the beginning, for a bunch of different reasons. Yes, sir.
I had a question.
Please.
So I remember when I was reading about this, that they said that the law would, if anybody were to cross that line, they would be forced to go back.
By whom?
And I know, and there were also people already living there.
Yes.
And they would have to be forced out. And it is something that made me kind of laugh. Those people that are living there they are armed with guns. So
Yeah.
if they try to force them out.
Well, so Kevin is making the point. Yes, he's absolutely right. This is an unworkable, unenforceable law from the get-go. The minute they sign this piece of paper, the line is already out of date because there's already thousands of pioneer and settlers and farmers on the other side of the line. So already, the line doesn't make sense because there's already people on the other side. Number two, who's going to enforce this? How do you enforce that? What is the only way to enforce that line? To put British troops along the line. Well, the whole point of everything that's happening now is Great Britain is trying to save money. The war was expensive. This is a 1,000-mile line. If you're going to put troops that need to be fed and clothed and paid and supplied along a 1,000-mile frontier away from the water where they're easy to kind of... It's going to cost more than the war. So in fact, there are very, very, very few British soldiers in this entire part of North America. So not only is it obsolete, outdated, it's also unenforceable. And to make matters worse, the American colonists, had there ever been restrictions on where they could settle? No. If you wanted to pick up and move 5 miles down to the frontier and clear the woods and plant the farm and build a cabin, you could do it. Americans look at this line and say, the British are interfering with our God-given liberty to live wherever the hell we would like to live. If we want to live here and not here, why should some government in London have the right to tell us where I can clear out a couple acres of land and plant a crop? And the colonists start to say, the British in London are not out there for our best interests. And quite frankly, they're right. Is Great Britain legislating in the colony's best interests? No, they're legislating in the best interests of who? Of the whole British Empire. Not just pioneers in the backwoods of the colonies. To make matters even worse, the problem with a law that is unenforceable is what happens.
It gets broken.
It gets broken and then nobody gets punished for breaking it. And then let's say I'm the government, I say, you cannot do X. And then everybody does X, and nothing happens to them. How does that make me look? Makes me look foolish. Makes me look dumb. It makes me look like I'm out there proclaiming things that I cannot enforce. This is like if you tell a parent, don't make a threat that you will not follow through on. Don't tell your kid, I'm going to leave you on the side of the road if you keep kicking your brother in the back seat, because guess what? You ain't going to leave your kid on the side of the road, hopefully.
For like 5 minutes, like just we drive up a little bit just to get scared.
But you cannot, if you keep doing that, I'm going to throw you out the window. Well, hopefully you're not going to throw your kid out the window. But you shouldn't be saying it, when you're in a position of authority, do not be saying things that you are not able to do. And that's what the British government did here. They passed a law that they could not enforce. And it made them, A, look like they were not legislating in the benefit of the colonies, and B, it made them look foolish, it made them look ridiculous. And it gave Americans kind of this sense that British laws are sort of meant to be broken.
Disobeyed.
Disobeyed, yeah.
I also remember reading that the British, well, once they got that new king who was like really young,
Yes, George III.
they began to become less intelligent and lost their.
Yes, that's all. Yes, you're right. That once this stuff kind of starts to roll, we are dealing with a new king, a young king who wants to kind of leave his mark on his government with his policies. That Kevin, you are right. That George III does play a significant role here. But before George III is king, we have the next thing, the Sugar Act. This is a financial thing. The war is expensive. Colonists pay virtually no taxes. The 13 colonies were pretty much the lowest taxed society in the history of the world. That the average person did not pay more than maybe 1% of their income to taxes, 2% maybe. That everybody, rich, poor, paid very, very little in taxes in the 13 colonies. Well, Britain fights this war. It costs hundreds of millions of pounds. And they have to pay for it. They went into debt to fight it. And the British look over at the colonies and they say, well, these colonists are really rich. And they were. And they're paying no taxes. And they weren't. And people in Britain are paying lots of taxes. So it kind of stood to reason that, well, the colonists benefited from the war. The French threat is gone. Let's tax the colonists. So the first thing they did was the Sugar Act. Sugar Act, pretty much all the Sugar Act said was we are actually going to enforce mercantilism. All of the taxes, all the fees, all of the imposts, all the tariffs, for the first time ever, we're enforcing them. We're sending inspectors to the colonies. We are setting up admiralty courts. We are ordering tax collectors to their posts. We are going to take mercantilism seriously. Well, holy crap. That is a problem in the colonies. Why?
They're no longer rich.
Well, they're very rich. The colonists are the wealthiest society in the world in the 1760s, per capita. Why is the enforcement of mercantilism such a huge problem? That's it.
They have to follow it.
They have to follow it now. Americans had gotten very, very used to kind of wink, wink, wink at all of those mercantilist laws, and they pretty much manufactured what they wanted, traded with whom they wanted, whenever they wanted. Kind of paying lip service to the rules. Well, now all of a sudden there's more inspectors, more tax collectors, an admiralty court. Lots of people that had a very nice living, kind of winking their way at mercantilism, are now threatened by this. And if there's going to be some inspector saying, all right, I see your cargo has such and such, you owe the British government, 150 pounds. Well, that's the first time you got to pay. It's always been the law, but just for the last decades, No one's ever enforced it. And you start to get the first cries of that saying that goes down in history because it rhymes so nicely. That the colonists claimed, what did they claim? That they were being taxed.
No taxation without representation.
No taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. Now, we have to talk about what this word means there. What does it mean, no taxation without representation? Let's just get to the slogan. If this was 2014, there'd be internet memes. Taxation without representation. It fits easily on a bumper sticker or on an internet meme, or it's easy. What does it mean, no taxation without representation? Maria, what do you think that means? What's it mean? What? What do you think it means? Come on, Maria. Well, what is taxation? What is taxation? The government. Okay, so no taxation without what? Without representation. What is representation? What's the root of the word? What's the root of the word representation? Wait, what's the root of the word representation? What is the root of that word, representation? You know what the word root is? Okay, so what's the root of the word representation? You gonna look at me? Tell me the root of the word. I know you know. What's the root of the word, Maria? What is the root of the word representation? What is the root of the word?
I've always hated this most, I never wanted to try.
Represent. So what does it mean to represent?
On the actual, yeah, the actual thing. And then we actual either. He's never tried it.
Yeah, so when you have a lawyer that represents you, what does that mean? So if you have a lawyer that represents you, what does that mean?
With the blue one?
He's helping you by doing what? By doing what? When he represents you,
I go fishing with him.
he tries to prove your case. He is standing in for you. He's the guy that knows the law, that is helping you, stands in for you. So you don't have to make all the legal arguments, he does. So what does it mean to be represented? Somebody does what? If you're being represented by someone, what does that mean? Someone is standing in for you. So what does it mean, no taxation without representation? Somebody went in Britain, government, yeah. All right, what do you got? Bree, you want to tell us? What is no taxation without representation?
The colonies wouldn't pay unless they were represented by the government.
That they wouldn't pay their taxes unless they had representation in government. So, let's go back to this is all about consent of the governed. That we remember we had a whole lecture on all of the colonies were ruled or were run by these kind of local assemblies. In all 13 colonies, we talked about this last month, that the 13 colonies all were run by and large by local assemblies, elected by locals, represented by locals, that every local town had their own representative, every city had their own representative in these legislative governing bodies. Who taxed the people of Connecticut? Not the British. Their local assemblies. That the local assembly of Connecticut, the Connecticut Popular Assembly, passed taxes. And why did people agree to pay those taxes? How did they show their consent? How did they show their consent to this? They what? How did they show their agreement? They might have grumbled, they might not have liked it, but how is it that they showed their consent? Well, they paid, and why did they think it was a legitimate tax? When you reach in your pocket and grumble and say, oh, fine, all right, I'll pay the tax, why are you agreeing to do it? Because it's by your own people. You have been taxed by your own representatives. If you don't like your own representative, what do? Choose someone else. Vote for someone new. Mr. Smith raised the taxes. Vote Mr. Smith out of office next year. And the local assemblies made American colonists used to the fact that they could only be taxed by people that they themselves voted for. Do the colonists vote? So, who passes the Sugar Act? The British Parliament. Do colonists vote for members of Parliament? No. And that's why they said no taxation without representation. You cannot reach into my pocket unless I give you permission to do so. And I only give you permission to do so if I play a part in picking the people who are going to reach into my pocket. You're going to reach into my pocket, say the colonists. I at least have to be voting for your ability to do so. And if I am a total stranger that you don't have, if you can't get rid of me, I have no right to reach into your pocket. I cannot tax your hard-earned living if I'm not responsible to you. That makes sense? That's called actual representation. This is what we do this is what we have in the United States. In the United States, we have something called actual representation. When you vote for a congressman, anyone know who the congressman for most of the city of Elizabeth is? Anyone know? Sorry? Who? He's a mayor. Who is your congressman? Anyone know?
That's the
Chris
governor.
Christie's the governor.
What does it start with?
His first name or his last name? D. Donald. Donald is right. Your congressman is Donald Payne, most of you, but Elizabeth has 2 congressmen because the city's divided in half congressionally. Donald Payne Jr. is one of the representatives. He's a representative for the 8th District of New Jersey. What does that mean? Donald Payne Jr. is one of 435 congressmen. Donald Payne Jr., when he sits in the halls of Congress, who does he represent? Not New Jersey.
Elizabeth.
The 8th District of New Jersey, part of which encompasses Elizabeth, part of which encompasses Hillside, part of which encompasses Newark, but he represents that. The guy who sits in Congress from the 3rd District from New Jersey is John Runyon. Who does he represent?
The other half of the district.
No, the 3rd District, wherever that is, it's down in like Ocean County. The 3rd District is that means John Runyon, when he casts votes in Congress, whose interests is he supposed to have in mind? The 3rd District. When Donald Payne casts votes in Congress, whose interests is he supposed to have in mind? 8th District. If Donald Payne does not have the support of the 8th District, then the voters of the 8th District can do what? Kick him out. New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, is represented by 2 senators, Robert Menendez and Cory Booker. When Robert Menendez and Cory Booker cast votes in Congress, who are they casting votes on behalf of? The people of New Jersey. New Jersey has specific interests. New Jersey has 2 senators whose job it is to actually represent New Jersey. The 2 senators from Utah, who do they represent? The citizens of Utah, not the citizens of New Jersey. They cast their votes based on, in their opinion, what is best for Utah. The senators for New Jersey cast their votes on their opinion of what is best for New Jersey. Point being, in the United States, from this time, from colonial times, we developed this idea that representation should be what we call actual. That the guy from the 8th District has to be from the 8th District. You cannot run for senator of New Jersey unless you are from, and not from, but living in, where? New Jersey. This is actually a problem for a senator from Louisiana. Right now there's a senator from Louisiana, her name is Mary Landrieu. She is in a very tough re-election fight. Her opponent has made the point, Senator Landrieu no longer really lives in Louisiana.
Wait, she has the house there, or she lives somebody else?
Well, the problem is, on all of her official paperwork, Mary Landrieu, on all of her official paperwork, she put that she lives at her mom's house. Because she doesn't have an address in Louisiana anymore. She lives over in Washington, D.C. So her opponent in this senatorial election is, how can Mary Landrieu represent the citizens of Louisiana if she doesn't even live in Louisiana anymore? She's been captured by Washington, D.C., and she no longer understands or knows about the concerns of voters in Louisiana. And it's a very good possibility that she will not be a senator after the election, and she will be voted out. Because in the United States, we take this concept of actual representation seriously. That to actually represent the 8th District of New Jersey, you have to be from the 8th District of New Jersey and get voted in by the voters of the 8th District of New Jersey. That is not how it's done in England.
Faculty who need IDs, please come down to the main office. Faculty who need IDs, please contact the main office if you need the coverage or something. Thank you.
In Great Britain, members of Parliament are supposed to virtually represent the entire British Empire. What that means is if you're a member of Parliament from Southampton, you are not supposed to only think of Southampton when you vote. You represent what? The entire thing, the whole British Empire. That the members of Parliament do not represent geographic areas. The members of Parliament represent the interests of the whole British Empire. So, this is where we have the British on one side, the Americans on the other side. They say the word, the Americans say, no taxation without representation. And the British say, you are represented. By whom?
Parliament.
By Parliament. Who represents? So if you say, all right, let's approach it like this. A colonist in Pennsylvania. You ask that colonist in Pennsylvania, do you have representation in Parliament? And what would that colonist say, John?
No.
No. Why not?
Because they're not, because I don't vote for them.
Because you, the colonists in Pennsylvania, did not vote for anybody that sits in Parliament. If I said to a British subject, does that colonist in Pennsylvania has representation in Parliament? Zaneti, what would your answer be? Yes. Why? I'm sorry? Oh, he's in Pennsylvania. Here's John. Here's Zaneti. Zaneti's in Pennsylvania. You talk to a British guy. Would he say that you have representation in Parliament? Yes. Why? Kiani, what?
I guess that organization in Parliament because she's in the colonies, and that's what she is.
So what?
So,
Who is representing you in Parliament, Zaneti?
like, the government,
Who represents you in Parliament?
people, that's like,
No. You didn't vote for anybody in Parliament. You don't get to vote for Parliament. Who represents you in Parliament? From the British point of view.
the parliament,
So who represents you in Parliament?
people that are in parliament.
Everyone in Parliament. That's virtual representation. In America, Zaneti expects actual representation. Zaneti says, unless I'm voting for someone that sits in Parliament, I'm not represented in Parliament. But the British would say representation is virtual. That you are represented by every single member of Parliament. Does that make sense? Every MP is not responsible. In the United States, we have to get away from the way we do things here, mentally. In the United States, every position is actually represented. The 8th District, the 3rd District, the 14th District of Ohio, the 44th District of California, the 32nd District of Texas. They all represent individual districts. But in Great Britain, everybody in Parliament, in theory, is supposed to represent whom?
The British citizens.
Every British citizen, whether they are in Britain, Pennsylvania, India, Fiji, Africa, it doesn't matter. Everyone is represented in Parliament. So if I say to an American colonial, are you represented in Parliament? You would say no, because I didn't vote for anybody in Parliament. But if I ask a British person, Are the Americans represented in Parliament? The answer is yes. Because the people who sit in Parliament represent... I don't think we're getting this at all. I see a lot of confusion out there. Who represents New Hampshire in the United States Senate?
The senator of New
Senator from New Hampshire. Who represents New Jersey, United States Senate? Senator from New Jersey. Who represents New York? Who represents New Mexico? Colorado, Alaska, or Alabama? In this, what do we call this? What kind of representation? In Great Britain, who represents London? Parliament. Who represents Southampton? Who represents Essex? Who represents Wessex? Who represents Sussex? Who represents Pennsylvania? Who represents Africa? Parliament. Every guy who sits in Parliament represents what?
British citizens.
Where?
Britain.
No.
Everywhere.
All over. Every British subject is represented equally in Parliament. Even though, where are the people in Parliament from? They're from Great Britain. What do we call this? Virtual. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Are we clearer on this concept now? Actual representation versus virtual representation. So, because we're not going to finish this now. When the Americans say, you are taxing us without our consent, you are taxing us when we have no representation in Parliament, an American understands that to mean there is nobody from Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, North Carolina in Parliament, because there's not. Great Britain, when an American says, no taxation without representation, what does a British person say? You are represented. Virtually. Just like everybody in Britain is represented virtually. That members of Parliament do not represent individual localities. I'm sorry? They represent the whole, not individual places. So, we're going to see this dynamic at work here. We're also going to see this dynamic at work when we look at the coming of the Civil War. That you have two sides saying the same word, but meaning it completely differently. When an American says representation, Carla, what does he mean?
A British?
When an American colonist in Pennsylvania says representation, what does he mean?
That they are able to vote for the person that represents them.
Bingo! And we call that what?
Actual.
Actual representation. When you have a minister of the crown say, you are represented, Carla, what does he mean? Who represents Carla in the British view of the world, Mario? Parliament. Because what's the word? Parliament represents everybody
Virtually.
virtually. Cool?
Yeah.
Moving on. Then the British pull off, quite frankly, a very stupid law. Stamp Act. From the reading. What's Stamp Act? Ariel, what's Stamp Act?
The Parliament passed Stamp Act saying that all printed matter in the colonies, including but not limited to newspapers, pamphlets, and licensed and legal acts, in order to be legally sold unless carried stamp.
Ariel, you read! That's actually my fault. You're going to read this tonight. You didn't read this last night. That's my fault. Stamp Act says, sorry?
You pay for stamp.
You pay every piece of paper, pretty much, that you use in official business needs to carry a stamp. And including newspapers, including licenses to operate bars. These are very dumb people to put taxes on. Because if you're going to put a tax that the newspaper man doesn't like, where's he going to talk about it? In the newspaper, which gets his complaint out to who? A lot of people. If you're going to put a tax on the bartender, he's going to complain about it at the bar, to everybody sitting there at the bar. The British really were not brilliant in this one. They managed to put a tax on the two classes of people most likely to have gigantic audiences to complain about them. The Stamp Act is a disaster for the British from the beginning. The Americans say you can't do this. You cannot directly tax us like this without our consent. And the Stamp Act, so these groups like the Sons of Liberty start to pop up. And what the Sons of Liberty pretty much do is they go to the stamp collectors' houses and threaten them. And they go to the stamp masters' houses and tar and feather them. And they break into the warehouses where all the stamps are, drag them out, have a big old bonfire on a town green.
Sam Adams, right?
Sam Adams amongst them. There's a whole lot. Those are the leaders. But Sons of Liberty included young people, old people, working class people, poor people, middle class people, all who say that Parliament has no right to tax the colonies without our consent. The problem for the British is this: how are they going to enforce this? Well, they have two choices. They can send troops, but the whole point of the Stamp Act is to do what? Make money. And if you're going to have to enforce it with imperial troops, you're not going to be making any money, because it's going to cost a lot of money to pay all those soldiers. Can they use the American militia? Why not?
You're taxing them too.
They're the mob. The militia is the mob. You don't like, let's go burn all the stamps. Come on, let's go, everybody out of your houses. Come on, big old party, let's go, everyone. Well, that's the militia. Now they're the mob. Walking over, cheering, yelling, singing, dancing down to the stamp collector's house. They drag him out of his front yard, they tar and feather him, carry him through the streets, burn the stamps. Who the hell's going to stop him? Nobody. The Stamp Act is a disaster from the British point of view, because A, it doesn't collect any money, costs a lot of money to try to enforce, and makes a lot of people not like them. They also passed something at the time called the Quartering Act, which pretty much said, if the British have troops in colonies, the colonists have to let them live in their house.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Wait.
What?
That's the Third Amendment.
What?
Oh, yeah.
So basically the way this works,
Can you repeat that?
if there are British troops in town, the townspeople themselves have to feed, feed and house the troops. Ordinary working class people, you would be required to have an ordinary soldier live in your house. Middle class people, you'd have to have like a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant or something live in your house. And the upper class elite people, well, you had to put all officers up with you. And officers expect to be entertained, and to have good food, and to sleep in a nice bed. And if you don't do that, guess what? They have guns. So, this created a lot of anger in the colonies. So much anger that it later got legalized in the Constitution as the Third Amendment. Third Amendment says Congress cannot make soldiers live in your house unless it's a time of war and Congress passes a law. But in normal course of events, no soldiers can live in your house.
Unless they're your family, right? Something like that.
Well, of course, but with your consent, without the owner's consent. This actually has come up in the last couple of years in constitutional law. And it's interesting the way it's come up. And the argument, people are using the Third Amendment to argue against this. What police are doing is if police want to have surveillance on a house in your neighborhood, let's say they think it's a drug dealer house, are you required to let the police be in your house to do surveillance?
No.
It's unclear. People who are fighting this in court are making a Third Amendment case. They're saying that the Third Amendment makes it illegal for the police to use my house for surveillance unless I give them permission to. It's an interesting argument.
What if that?
You can get a warrant, right?
You can get a warrant for your house,
No, but the police to go into your house.
only if they have probable cause. If they say, we just want to go into John's house to look around and see if he's doing anything illegal, then he won't get a warrant for that. And if they just want to use your house to look at your neighbor's house, there's no warrant. What's the warrant? You know, a warrant has to give, we think John committed a crime, this is the crime, this is the evidence we think we're going to find in his house. And if they can't provide that, they won't get a warrant. Now, the Stamp Act was such a disaster. Now, while the Sons of Liberty are doing their thing, more elite, educated Americans are doing their thing. They're writing pamphlets. They're writing, treatises. They're saying, philosophically, the British do not have the right to tax us for all these different reasons. They're writing letters to Parliament. They're writing letters to their friends in England. And the English soon understand what a disaster this Stamp Act is in the colonies. So they repeal it. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act. But on the same day, they passed what is called the Declaratory Act. And what's the root of this word? Declare. The Declaratory Act is a very simple law. It says, Parliament may legislate for the colonies in anything, anytime, any place, anywhere, for anything. It is an expression of sovereignty. What Parliament is saying with the Declaratory Act is that we are in charge. Not the colonies, we are. The problem with this is once you have to stamp your foot and say, I'm in charge here, what does that kind of mean?
You're not.
You're not really. That if a teacher has to stand up at the front of the room and say, I'm in charge here, you will listen to me because I'm in charge, you're not going to have, that's a teacher that's going to have some problems, I think. That once you have, I wasn't naming names. You can name names.
No, because he's like,
I'm aware of, I know.
right?
I know.
Yesterday, it's like, I am a teacher. You must listen.
Once you are backed up to simply appealing to naked authority, you're going to have problems. So in the Declaratory Act, Parliament says we can legislate anytime, any place, anywhere, anything for any colony. That violates the colonists' sense and the colonists' understanding of the concept of sovereignty, which is our second concept. Well, we're going to do a race in 80. This is a tricky concept. What is sovereignty? What's the root of this word?
Sovereign.
Sovereign. What is that? Ruler. The sovereign is a synonym for the king. The king is the sovereign. It's a noun and an adjective. The king is the sovereign, and the king is sovereign. What does that mean? If the king is sovereign, the king is in charge. The highest power, I like it, who said that? The highest power. Authority stops at the king.
Wait, what about, oh wait.
There is no appeal beyond the king. He is sovereign. In England, sovereignty is understood to be where? Who's in charge in England?
King.
The king and Parliament. That in England, sovereignty is understood in a constitutional device known as King in Parliament. That the king and Parliament are sovereign. But in the colonies, just like representation had been understood to mean something different than it did in England, sovereignty also comes to be understood as being found elsewhere, besides in the king and in Parliament. Where is sovereignty in the colonies, in the minds of the colonials?
The people.
The people. The people. Through what?
Vote.
Through their vote, through their legislative assemblies. But in the end, in the colonies, the people are sovereign. So when Parliament says, we are sovereign over everything, are they legally correct?
Yes.
Yes. The colonies are British. British subjects, British flag, God save the king, the whole thing. Does Parliament have the legal right to legislate for them and everything? Yes. Including, the colonists say, darkly, colonists start to, all this stuff's going on, the colonists start to get this sense there's a big conspiracy afoot, that the British are out there to take their liberties away. The liberty to move where they want. The liberty to run their businesses how they want. The liberty to say what they want without having to pay a tax. The liberty to invite people into their own houses. All these liberties seem to be being taken by the British government. And now Britain says, we're in charge of everything. Does that also mean the liberty to cancel our local assemblies?
No.
Would Parliament say that it had the power to cancel local assemblies?
Yes.
Sure. Anything, anytime, anywhere. They're sovereign. If they don't like the Massachusetts General Assembly, they can cancel it. And the Americans start to say, hey, this declaratory act pretty much says Britain can do whatever the heck it wants.
Wait, so this act is just as bad as the Stamp Act?
It's worse in a lot of ways. The Stamp Act is specific for one thing. Now here's the British saying, we're sovereign. You are the colonies. We are in charge, and but we have the right, the ability, and the power to legislate anything, anytime, anywhere in North America. And a lot of colonists start to develop this idea that there is a conspiracy out there to take their rights. And they start to look at all these things they say. Then the Township Acts. More mercantilist acts. More indirect taxes. More anger.
What's that word?
Township.
Township?
Townshend. That's the guy's name. He
Oh.
was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. Mr. Townshend. He puts all of these revenue-raising acts. And for the first time, sends troops. Now the British send British imperial troops to the New World. in large, not large numbers, but several thousand, to enforce mercantilism. And that's the presence, that's the fact that leads to what's known as the Boston Massacre. In the winter of 1770, British troops are in Boston. They are guarding a customs house where taxes and tariffs and imposts are collected. There's a small troop of them, I think 7 soldiers and an officer, 6 soldiers and an officer, a small detachment of British troops are guarding the customs house down near the wharves in Boston. Bunch of boys show up, start making fun of the soldiers, chucking snowballs at them. Ha ha, you lobsterbacks, here, ha ha. Sons of Liberty kind of hear that this is going on, they show up. They kind of escalate a little bit. They start throwing rocks. They start putting ice in the middle of the snowballs, chucking ice balls at the soldiers. Night falls. Crowd kind of grows bigger. They got pitchforks and they got torches, all yelling and jeering and throwing stuff at these British soldiers. And in the confusion, people are yelling, it's cold. It escalated. Somebody, the British soldiers, cocked their weapons to scare the crowd off. They shoulder their weapons. Whether there was ever an order to fire, nobody knows. But to make a long story short, one of those 6 soldiers shot his gun, and as soon as one shot their gun, the 6 of them all fired. 5 Americans were killed, a 6th died the next day. Paul Revere puts together a glorious piece of political propaganda that night. This was in the newspapers the next day. Let's have a look. Paul Revere's gloriously propaganda piece of political art over here. This is what appeared in Boston the next day. This bears pretty much no relationship to reality.
Look, he's ordering it.
First, we have a British officer clearly ordering them to fire. They are all firing simultaneously. Do you see any pitchforks, snowballs, torches in the hands of these poor innocent colonists over here? No. Is it the middle of the night when it's dark and hard to see? No.
Wait, what about the moon?
Is it dark? Paul Revere throws up one, is there a moon in the sky in the afternoon a lot? Yeah. Here we have these poor innocent colonists gunned down in cold blood by the British soldiery. And folks, in the absence of Twitter, in the absence of news, other news sources, in the absence of people's camera phones, when you open the newspaper the next day and you see this, guess what? This is reality. This becomes your reality. Why? Well, it's in a newspaper. Everyone respects Paul Revere. He's a well-known silversmith, patriot, all-around good guy.
Unhappy Boston.
It's called Unhappy Boston. The sons deplore. I mean, look at all the words that they use. And it creates all of this anger that now, not only are the British trying to take our rights away from us, now they're shooting us in cold blood. The 6 soldiers and their officer are arrested and charged with murder.
Didn't John Adams take the case of
Yes.
arrested by who?
The government of the city of Boston.
Oh.
Well, weren't they soldiers for Boston?
There's British soldiers.
Oh,
These are imperial British soldiers, redcoats, lobsterbacks. They're arrested by the city government of Boston, or the colonial government of Massachusetts. John Adams takes up the case. Now, John Adams is a cool guy in a lot of ways. And tomorrow's lecture is short, so we will finish this tomorrow, so just gonna talk for a few minutes about John Adams. Tuesday. Tuesday, we will finish this lecture on Tuesday. But John Adams is worth talking about for just a few minutes. But most people, a lot of people will say, I don't care what other people think of me, I do what I think is right. Most people, when they say this, are full of crap. John Adams is one of those rare people who truly did not care what anybody thought about him, except for maybe his wife, who was awesome in her own right. John Adams says, this was not murder. This is not right. This was not murder. These men were provoked and should not hang for what happened at Boston Massacre. John Adams takes a huge risk in taking up this case. The whole city of Boston wants to see these guys hanging from trees. And John Adams says no, and takes up the case, and manages to get acquittals for, I think, 4 of them, and appealed the sentences of it. No one lost their life for this, which is good, because none of them deserve it. But we're going to see, where you should see, if you kind of follow it, many examples of John Adams' independence of mind. He's got a lot of personal faults. He could be jealous, he could be vindictive, he could be angry, John Adams could. But he was definitely his own man. We'll see at the end of this block, goes against his entire party when he's president to preserve peace with France. When he had every right to declare war on France. He chose not to. So we're going to see this independent-minded, tough old SOB, John Adams, throughout the course. Now, why are you packing up and why are you standing up? Sit down. Do not pack up. I'm going to start it and see how far we can get. Once there's blood in the streets, that makes everything different. It's one thing to talk. It's one thing to complain. It's one thing to publish articles. It's one thing to tar and feather the stamp collector. It's one thing to burn the stamp. Now there's blood. Now people are dead. That kind of makes both sides back off a little bit. And actually we're going to see, for about 3 years after the Boston Massacre, things calm down. Kind of get back to some degree of normal. Because nobody wants any more killing in the streets. In 1773, the British government passes something called the Tea Act that is going to start the process very quickly back in motion. That's going to lead to bloodshed. And the Tea Act has absolutely nothing to do with the colonies. Remember back in 2008, during the beginning of the recession, all those banks and mortgage companies were out of money. They went to the government for a bailout. They said, if you don't bail us out, federal government, we are going to go bankrupt and take people's life savings and their mortgages with us. So we need federal government money to bail us out. And the federal government bailed them out. Bipartisan, $800 billion later, all of these banks and insurance companies got bailouts from $800 billion. A lot less than what we owe. The Tea Act started with something similar. The British East India Company was bankrupt. And they went to the British government and said, hey, we need a bailout. since you walked into this classroom, what you walk in here, about an hour ago? Since you walked into this classroom an hour ago, the federal government has spent around $70 million. Everything. It's about $7 million a minute. Yes, it's an inconceivably large number. $20 million for the government is literally what they spend in 3 minutes. But the British East India Company went to Parliament and said, we need a bailout. And Parliament said, okay. And one of the things they gave to this company was the right to sell tea to everybody in the British Empire. That Parliament would use its money to support the East India Tea Company, British East India Company, and that everyone in the British Empire, if they were going to buy tea, had to buy it from them. This law has nothing to do with the colonies. It is not passed with the colonies in mind. Its effect on the colonies they didn't think about. It is a law to support this company. And when the colonists hear about it, all hell breaks loose. And the colonists, that dark thinking, that conspiratorial thinking, that they said, this is a conspiracy. This is a conspiracy in 2 ways, say the colonists. Way number 1, here's the British government trying to tell us how to run our economic lives. They're saying if we want to buy tea, we got to buy it from this one company. They're trying to tell us what we have to do, what we can do, what we cannot do. That's why it's a conspiracy in the first regard. The second regard is even deeper. This government is being supported by tax dollars. If you have to buy stuff from that company supported by tax dollars, if you agree with it, what are you agreeing that Parliament has the power to do? What? Which is called, what's it called when the government takes your money?
Oh.
Taxes?
Taxes. The colonists, the radicals, the patriots, they see this act as an underhanded way to get the colonists to accept being taxed. And they say, if we agree to this Tea Act, we're saying that Britain, 1, has the right to tell us how to run our affairs economically, and 2, we're saying that they have the right to tax us without our consent, without being represented. And all hell breaks loose. Sons of Liberty back. Committees of correspondence back. Letters, angry letters written back. Newspapers talking about it back. And the Sons of Liberty, and the British government says, nope, this one we're enforcing. And they order these ships full of tea to dock in Boston. And a standoff ensues. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, says that tea is being unloaded, and that's the tea you're going to buy. All you American colonists. And the patriots and the radicals say, nope, we are not unloading the tea. No one from Boston is going to work to unload that tea.
Wait, so, no, what I was gonna ask is, what if we just don't want to buy tea?
So that's the other thing. There's a boycott. Everybody says no one's buying British goods. But not everybody does. Remember, not everybody agrees with the radicals and patriots. A lot of people are like, fine, I want to drink tea. I don't care if I'm fine with my virtual representation. I'm going to drink the damn tea. The tea's cheaper. Anyway, believe it or not, it's cheaper tea. The problem is philosophical. The patriots say, if we agree to buy this cheap tea, we're selling our soul to Great Britain. We're saying that they can run our economic affairs and tax us whenever they want. They say we have to be intellectually consistent. If we don't like this tax and that tax and that tax, and we say no taxation without representation, no taxation without representation, no taxation without representation, oh, that's fine. It's not, you're not being consistent. The British say, This has nothing to do with the colonies, drink the frickin' tea. And the colonists say, we're not gonna drink the tea, and this standoff ensues. Governor Hutchinson orders British troops the next day, or later in the week, to unload the tea. That night, a bunch of Sons of Liberty decide that they are going to take matters in their own hands and they are going to end this standoff right now. They dress as Indians, they board the ships, they chuck the tea into the harbor, and that is the Boston Tea Party. Why they dress as Indians?
So that,
Everyone knew who they were.
Oh.
It's the Sons of Liberty.
It's because when they went to court that the people could, oh, I guess that's some Indians going on.
Exactly. It's so when they're charged with destruction of government property, no one can, witnesses have the ability to say, I don't know who it was, it was some Indian. I don't know who that guy was, it was some Indian. Gives them plausible deniability. Indians are also a symbol of freedom already by that time in American culture. Well, this is the breaking point for the British. The British say, this is ridiculous. We are not engaged in a conspiracy to take Americans' rights. The Americans are being absolutely out of their skull, out of their gourd, crazy on this one. And now they say, you know what? Now we're going to drop the hammer. And once they learn of the Boston Tea Party, the British pass what they call the Coercive Acts. What does coercive mean? If I coerce you into doing something. Not fool, not convince. Force. Good. I force you into doing something. Please give me all your money. Give me all your money. That's a very different sentence, isn't it? That's coercion. Please sleep with me. No. Sleep with me or I'll fire you. That's coercion. To force.
Aye. Where's the 6 figures at?
Hey,
That's all the money.
That's coercion. The British say, here's the story, colonists. Until you pay for the tea and stop all of this silliness, the following things are coming down. Number one, we're closing the port of Boston. No ships in, no ships out until you pay for the tea. Number two, we are dissolving the Massachusetts General Assembly.
Which they were afraid of.
Which is what we'll call. The Massachusetts Assembly is dissolved. Number three, trial by jury, out. In Massachusetts, if you're going to be tried, we're going to take you back to England. We're going to try you there. Number four, more troops coming into town. This is, see, now we've upped the stakes. This is the British government being serious. We're going to shut off your economic lifeblood. We're going to cancel your self-government. We're going to take away your right to a jury trial. Because jury trials weren't where everyone and their mother knew that these people were guilty, but they were getting off. Because nobody in Boston would convict them. The Americans have a name for these coercive acts. They call them the intolerable acts. And these, of course, people all over the college are talking, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about this? What's going on with our brethren up in Boston? At the same time, the British passed something called the Quebec Act, which has nothing to do with colonies. But because in the colonists' minds, we have this whole list of things where the British are trying to take our rights away, it seems like this is just another example of that. And it has to do with what the British are going to let French Catholics do in Canada. It's not that important. What is important is how it's perceived. It's perceived as just another example of the British taking American liberties away. In response to this, the First Continental Congress is called. 14 colonies are invited, 12 come. Georgia doesn't come, Nova Scotia doesn't come. First Continental Congress makes a couple key decisions. This will be the last thing for today. Key decisions. Number one, continent-wide boycott of British goods. Nobody buys anything from Britain. Number two, American citizens, or British subjects in the colonies, are permitted to defend their rights by violence if necessary. Now, we'll start here on Tuesday. You have night number 2 for Tuesday. That's it, just night 2. Reading and lecture. I will see you all on Tuesday. And Sunday question window.
No video?
Yeah, reading and video. Night 2.